So you're saying that the commonly held view that the country is overwhelmingly in favour of capital punishment is wrong?
I do say that, absolutely.
Do you believe in hanging? I hope you don't.
We do.
You do?
Yes,
Well, I think you should read that.
I think hanging should come in.
I think it's a pity it's got to be brought back, and I hope it is brought back simply because I think it will stop violent crime.
To reintroduce capital punishment at this stage of that province's turmoil would be to produce a crop of martyrs and build up a store of memories on which violence would feed for many decades to come.
If we, as the cool, calm, collected British public, advocate capital punishment as being what we want to do with our criminals, then I think that we are putting ourselves on the same level as the criminal.
They should go to prison for life instead of getting hung.
I don't believe that we should have hanging because I think that the principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth is not moral.
I'd feel very embarrassed to be in Britain when we'd be the only country in Western Europe to retain hanging as a punishment.
We should be the only democracy in Europe to reintroduce the death penalty for murder.
I don't think the point is relevant. It may well be that all the others are wrong.
Every member needs to take very carefully into account the views of his constituents.
It is not a matter for a referendum, it's a matter for Parliament.
Parliament has totally ignored the will of the British people for, 10 or 15 years? And it is time that Parliament recognised the will of the British people, irrespective of what goes on anywhere else.
I believe that we are going to see referenda as part of a modern democracy, and it's clear from what I've said that I, for one, am an advocate of just that.
Mr Taylor, in what circumstances would you like to see hanging reintroduced?
I think the one which is most likely to go through the Commons is one which would say capital punishment for murder by means of firearms, explosives, or for the murder of a police and prison officer. It's going to obviously be a very narrow vote, and I think this is the one which is most likely to succeed, because it's pretty obvious that we could in fact deter in most of these cases, and I find that most of my MP friends, whether they're for or against, are desperately concerned about the increased use of firearms by criminals. What we want to do is to have a deterrent which will stop criminals carrying guns.
How do you react then to the latest evidence from America, where they say that there's no evidence that the absence of the death penalty increases murder and no evidence that having it acts as a deterrent?
Well, we've had this on many occasions, evidence quoted from America and other countries, and sometimes they can't be directly comparable because, of course, there was a long period when, because of a Supreme Court decision, capital punishment, although in existence, wasn't effective. What we can do is to look at the clear evidence from our own country. Now, I think that everyone watching your programme will be aware that when we had the deterrent of capital punishment, criminals in Britain hardly ever carried guns. In fact, there were many reports of gangs searching each other before they went out on a job to make sure that no one was carrying a gun because they could all swing together. Now, we do know that since abolition, there's been a dramatic increase in the use of guns by criminals engaged in serious crime. And it's not just a question of the statistics, which are frightening. We see this from watching our papers every day about guns being used for quite petty offences. We want to stop the guns being used, and the evidence is absolutely clear from our own country where we know the facts.
And yet in this country, a study by the Home Office in the 6 years following the abolition of the death penalty showed that the pattern for murder hadn't changed.
Well, of course, I'm afraid the figures are absolutely clear. We find that in the 20 years before abolition, there was in fact no increase in murder, an almost static figure of round about 300 or just under 300 killings per year. Since abolition, the average has gone up to over 500, and of course in 1980 we had a number of 620.
Mr. Taylor,
we hear all these statistics, but I'm afraid the facts are clear. Killing has increased substantially since abolition.
Mr. Taylor, thank you very much indeed.
Geoffrey Dickens, the Conservative MP for Littleborough and Saddleworth in Lancashire, is the architect of the bill to bring back hanging. He's been quoted as saying that hanging is barbaric, but he believes it's the only solution to the rising crime wave, a sentiment that has become increasingly widespread throughout the country. The reasons for these hardened attitudes are clear enough. An upsurge in terrorist offences, a series of child killings that have imbued the public mind with a sense of incomprehension, frustration and outrage. And then there is the huge increase in the number of armed robberies and other crimes in which lawbreakers carried weapons. The sawn-off shotgun is now as much a tool of the criminal classes as was once the crowbar. The police, too, seem to have abandoned their batons and armed themselves more frequently. All too often, it seems as if the bobby on the beat is but a memory. And as the law and the lawbreakers each resort more often to weaponry, the risks for police officers like PC Olds and innocent bystanders of being shot, wounded or killed have increased as well. In the 18 years before abolition in 1965, police say 11 officers were killed, compared with 30 in the 18 years after the death penalty was abolished. In 1971, there were 1.67 million crimes of all categories in Britain. In 1981, that figure was nearly 3 million. Crimes of violence rose to more than 47,000 in 1971 and some 56,300 in 1981. And crimes involving firearms rose from 1,734 in 1971 to 8,067 10 years later. Almost inevitably, such escalation led to a new clamouring by the police and the public for the ultimate punishment. 9 out of 10 people, according to a public opinion survey last month, want capital punishment restored for terrorists who kill and for child murderers. 85% favour hanging for police killers. 81% think armed robbers who kill should pay with their lives. And 77% believe sex murderers should also be executed. Hanging became the sole form of capital punishment in Britain in the early 16th century. In those days, the condemned had to climb a ladder, then jump off when ordered. Later, they were taken to the place of execution with their own coffins on a cart, which, once the rope was attached, simply drove off. In the 18th century, hanging was made the penalty for an increasing number of offences, from pickpocketing to forgery. Huge crowds turned out to watch the executions. A brutal murderer's end would be hailed with cheers. That of a pickpocket or forger might well incense the crowd. So the hangman's occupation was not without its dangers. Almost always unpopular, hangmen, in order to fortify themselves for the ordeal, frequently took to the bottle and bungled the execution. On this occasion, the rope broke. When a soldier named Hales was ineffectually hanged at Jersey, he was pardoned in consequence. Other men were hanged and lived to tell the tale in a surefire bestseller. John Smith, a common housebreaker, was reprieved 15 minutes after he'd been hanged. Amazingly, he survived. The last public hanging was in 1868, but opposition to the death penalty goes back 200 years. The execution of Ruth Ellis, the platinum blonde who was convicted of killing her lover in 1955, may well have contributed to a gradual softening of attitudes on the hanging issue. The crowds gathered for the execution as they had throughout the centuries, and as they waited for the fateful moment, extra police were brought in to hold them back. When the death notice was posted, the crowd fell silently away, and few people in Britain remained untouched by what had happened. And Ruth Ellis was the last woman to be hanged in this country. 9 years later, in August 1964, Peter Anthony Allen was executed at Walton Prison in Liverpool. At exactly the same moment, his partner in murder, John Robson Walby, was hanged at Strangeways Prison in Manchester. But from that time on, no man or woman has walked those final steps to the gallows. The first successful bill to abolish the death penalty became law in 1965 on a 5-year trial basis that became permanent in 1969. New moves were made to bring back hanging 10 years later, but the abolitionists won an unexpectedly large majority of 119, and a series of motions just over a year ago were also defeated. So this latest bill provides another chance to bring back hanging, but the issues will be hotly contested, issues which have scarcely changed in 200 years. Does the threat of death stop people committing murder? And what about terrorists? Would they be deterred, or would they welcome martyrdom? Is it moral for society to kill someone when as individuals we may not be prepared to do it ourselves? And how long can you keep filling up the prisons with lifers who, on average, come out again after 10.5 years, perhaps to kill again? Questions we'll be discussing on Channel 4 News tomorrow.
There are likely to be 7 separate votes a week tonight. A series of propositions have been pulled together to give the various supporters of capital punishment the chance to vote for what they feel most strongly about. The main motion will be simply to restore the death penalty for murder, but that will be followed by votes on specific categories: murder resulting from acts of terrorism, murder of police officers, and murder of prison officers in the course of their duties, murder by shooting or causing an explosion, murder in the furtherance of theft, and finally a catch-all vote for other offences of murder. The first speaker in favour of capital punishment will be senior Conservative backbencher Sir Edward Gardner. He said this would probably be the last opportunity for many years to put an end to what he called the reign of the armed criminal. The new Home Secretary, Mr. Brittan, has in the past voted in favour of capital punishment for terrorist murders. He's under pressure from some quarters to change his mind, but refused to disclose what line he'll take in the Commons debate. But would he reflect the division of views in the Cabinet?
Well, I don't think it's my task to reflect any personal view other than my own, but I think it is my job to give a balanced picture of the arguments and any factual information relevant to the issue, and that's what I shall try to do.
So you will point out that other cabinet ministers, for instance, are against the restoration of capital punishment?
Well, I don't think that there's any mystery about that, and whether I need refer to it is something you'll have to wait for.
Mr. Brittan said he wouldn't shirk the responsibility for life and death decisions that a vote for the death penalty would place upon him. Did he feel MP should take into account the strength of public opinion in favour of the death penalty?
Of course, every member of Parliament has fought an election, every member of Parliament has constituents, and every member of Parliament is exposed to what members of the public say. Whether or not members of Parliament follow what they regard as the majority view or not must be for them to decide, but plainly public opinion is an absolutely vital component in this debate. There's no question about that at all.
Supporters of the death penalty claim the voting could be close. Opponents say it'll be defeated again by at least 20 votes. It is, of course, a free vote where MPs are able to act according to their conscience.
The police, the public and prison officers are clamouring for a return to hanging. Murder is on the increase, they say. The reign of the armed criminal must be brought to an end. Terrorists must be taught a final lesson. But of all the arguments for and against a return to hanging, that of deterrence is perhaps the most contentious. There is no doubt that homicide, which covers murder, manslaughter and infanticide, is rising, or that all violent crime is on the increase. But statistics are a problem. They give no real clue as to whether the threat of death actually stops people committing murder, because different sets of figures can be found to support or refute either the pro or anti-hanging lobbies.
It's very debatable whether hanging does deter, but I think you have to put up with that. We shan't. That used to be my old argument in the old days. There's one crime, murder, in which society should give the most emphatic denunciation of all, capital punishment. That was my argument. And because my feeling was it did deter. But I don't believe it really does deter. I don't think hanging has all that deterrent effect.
Do you think anything would have?
No, I think when a man is out to murder, he murders.
A counter-argument is that in those old days, a gang intent on crime, like the great train robbers, would search each other to make sure no one carried a lethal weapon, and that hanging was a deterrent. Of course, deterrence clearly has little to do with 1/3 of all homicides, where the murderer either commits suicide or is found to be insane. The rest are classified as normal murders, and a great deal has been made of the fact that there's been a steady increase in these after abolition. But in fact, that rise began in 1964, before abolition, and the increase has been nothing like the rate of increase for other violent crimes. The argument over deterrence becomes even more heated when applied to terrorism. Anyone who commits this kind of offence deserves to pay with their life, the pro-hanging lobby say. Those who oppose hanging reply that such killers want martyrdom, and they point to Bobby Sands, the IRA hunger striker, who is now a cult figure.
I feel outraged myself. I feel at the moment there ought to be capital punishment. They ought to be hanged. I feel it very much, the same as everybody else. But then, as feelings die down, and it may be months after the occasion, it's a different atmosphere altogether. Are you to kill this man, to hang him? Are you society to do it? And then my feelings change. I think a large number of those people who are in favour of hanging, if they actually had to sit on a jury and decide the very question of an individual man, would find a lesser verdict if they had the opportunity.
In your view, is the legal profession for or against the return of hanging?
I think on the whole you'll find it all against the judges, and I think probably the bar and the legal profession would be a majority against capital punishment. Of course, you've got to remember another thing which influences some people. When there was capital punishment, it was all very dramatic, a tense court, waiting to hear what was, and then you know the sentence of death after the judge puts on his back cap and the chaplain says, "May the Lord have mercy on your soul." It's very dramatic, it's very tense, and really that's not a desirable state of affairs.
What does a judge think of at a moment like that, in that great moment of drama?
Well, of course, he is affected by it. He realizes he is pronouncing the sentence. But there he thinks of the individual. But of course, in my mind, there was always the thought, well, I'm only sentencing according to law. Of course, I did give evidence before the Royal Commission in favour of capital punishment for murder most foul. But after the debates in Parliament, after the latest one, I changed my mind. I think really on the ethical, the moral ground. Is it right for us as a society to do a thing, to hang a man, which none of us individually would be prepared to do, or even to witness?
But there is no shortage of volunteer hangmen. If capital punishment is barbaric, the pro-hanging lobby say, so is murder. And they point out that you never see the police photographs produced at murder trials, showing the terrible things murderers often do to their victims, whose grieving families are always the forgotten ones. The Church points out that a family's grief is hardly diminished just because a murderer is hanged, and more grief heaped on his or her family.
If you are going to use retribution to mark the seriousness of a moral offence, you must use a means which is not morally offensive. And capital punishment is, the old law of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Punishment should at least have the possibility of reformation, of moral reformation. If you kill someone, you don't give them a chance to reform. And there is no evidence, no hard evidence of deterrence. There is also the moral reason that mistakes can be made and have been made, and also it is spiritually degrading on those who have to carry it out, whether that be prison governors, judges, prison officers and the like. It's actually morally degrading for them to have in cold blood to kill someone. It's usually a worse act than that which was committed.
Prison governors who must attend executions are opposed to hanging roughly 6 to 1. And if capital punishment is reintroduced, some would undoubtedly leave the prison service rather than experience the depressive effect a hanging has on a prison population.
On the morning of the execution, there descends on the prison a quite dramatic silence. It really is a sort of silence that can be felt rather than... it's difficult to explain it, but it's quite uncanny. And it used to be common practice on the morning of an execution to stop any chiming clocks and that kind of thing in order to take away some of the sort of atmosphere that was building up. Every one of them these days have their own personal radios in prison. And so time, in that sense, is there available to them. They can count off the moments. They can engage in the total build-up to this act of finality that's going to take place.
The British Medical Association are evasive as to whether they are for or against hanging, whether it is ethical for a doctor to pronounce a person fit for execution.
As far as the BMA is concerned, it is not the medical profession's job to comment on hanging as a process. That is a matter between the state and the citizens. If the state decides and the citizens accept that hanging should be a form of punishment in this country, that is between the state and the citizens. What the doctor's involvement in that process is something that the BMA will have to look at very closely.
A somewhat lofty view which puts the BMA in the middle of a powerful alignment of police, public and prison officers for a return to hanging, and the judiciary, the Anglican Church, prison governors and prison chaplains and much of the medical profession firmly opposed to its return. And so the battle lines are firmly drawn and the arguments carefully marshalled for this great debate on hanging, a punishment that sometimes can be too final. And so in part 3 of this series, we will be looking at the miscarriages of justice, the innocent who have been hanged, the guilty who have not, and what it is like to be a lifer. The utter finality of death by hanging is perhaps the most persuasive weapon in the armoury of those who believe its restoration would be barbaric. Those who do not say the ultimate penalty need not be mandatory, but simply available to the courts. But mistakes can and do happen, and innocent men have swung for those who remain undetected, living on with the secrets and the constant fear of discovery. The oft-cited case of Timothy Evans is the classic in the field of miscarriages of justice. Do you remember that squalid little house in a Notting Hill cul-de-sac? Number 10, Rillington Place. It was an address so infamous that they later tore down the house and changed the name of the street. When an illiterate youth of 24 named Timothy Evans moved into the tiny top-floor flat with his pregnant wife, another tenant, John Reginald Halliday Christie, had already begun a career in killing. And he continued with it by strangling Evans' wife and later his baby son, cementing the victims into the walls and burying them in the garden. And in the years that followed, they found the remains of 4 more strangled women at the house. Timothy Evans was arrested and confessed to killing his wife, but later insisted he was innocent. He was hanged in March 1950, but 3 years later, Christie admitted that he was the guilty man. And much, much later, Evans was granted a free pardon, posthumously. Had capital punishment not been abolished in 1965, these 6 men, all convicted wrongly, would have hanged. Patrick Meehan. His first appeal against a murder conviction was turned down within a month, and under the old law he would then have had just 3 weeks to live. He was convicted in 1969 of killing an elderly woman, Rachel Ross, at her home in Scotland. Police inquiries led to Patrick Meehan, a former safe-blower who served 7 years of a life sentence for the crime. During that time, no fewer than 3 men confessed to the murder. And eventually, Meehan was set free with a royal pardon.
I feel like the lamb led to the slaughter. I'm an innocent man. I knew nothing about the crime, but to save face for this establishment, I'm being labelled as a man who is a murderer. I am a former safe blower. I've been a villain. I'm a clean villain. I've never hurt anybody, and everybody knows this.
Another man who would have been hanged was Michael McMahon. He served 10 years in prison. So did David Cooper, who was convicted with him, and like him knew the bitterness of seeing 5 appeals fail to win their freedom. They were convicted in 1970 of killing a sub-postmaster in Luton the previous September. Another man had been convicted, then freed, on the same evidence. The 2 men were eventually released after new alibi statements were obtained and a book written about them, pointing up the conflicting evidence of prosecution witnesses and evidence of bribes to police officers involved in the case. A national campaign was mounted to free Michael Luvaglio. Convicted of shooting a man in a Newcastle nightclub in 1967, he was freed on parole in 1979. It took 2 appeals to free Albert Taylor, jailed for life for molesting and murdering his girlfriend's 15-year-old sister. He was freed after describing the tick on a railway station clock and after 5 years in prison. Just 2 years ago, lorry driver Jack Preece was released after serving 8.5 years in prison. Accused of murdering a woman from Aberdeen in 1973, he was convicted mainly on forensic evidence. Now reunited with his family, he is deeply embittered, a man who cannot forgive the forensic scientist who gave evidence against him and was branded incompetent after withholding vital evidence in the case. Preece was freed and given a record £77,000 compensation. But can that ever be enough?
Never. Not at all, no way.
But it's quite a lot of money. I mean, it's a record amount.
It isn't a lot of money at all. How is it a lot of money? Would you give 8.5 years of your life up for 77,000?
Do you feel bitter?
Very, very bitter.
Why?
Well, because I lost all my life. I lost my freedom. I lost my family. My children had 8.5 years without a father. I had my mother worried to death, all the family worried to death. Right? Dirty, slimy looks and backslaggers they had.
If hanging had been enforced, you would be
I wouldn't be here. I'd be dead.
It is unlikely that any doctor in Britain would agree to that, The Hippocratic Oath precludes it. Yet a life sentence is a despairing prospect. And in America, where there are more than 1,100 men and 12 women in the death cells, some have asked to die, and their wish has been granted. There too there is a clamouring for the ultimate penalty. 11 years ago the Supreme Court banned the noose, the electric chair, the gun and the gas, but brought them back again in 1976, responding to general public alarm at the level of violent crime. 18,000 murders every year. The only significant industrialised countries using the death penalty in peacetime now are the Soviet Union, South Africa and America. A protocol, the first international legal instrument to ban the death penalty in peacetime, has now been signed by all West European countries except Britain.
Lunchtime in London's Covent Garden. Amnesty International is trying to draw attention to the matter preoccupying MPs this week, capital punishment. The demonstration is an outward sign of a whole network of pressures, most of them more subtle and less overt than this, being applied to MPs from outside Parliament in an attempt to influence Wednesday's vote. The idea of this stunt is to persuade the public to write off to their MPs, arguing against restoration. But the one MP involved, Alf Dubs, immediately came up against the problem facing the abolitionists.
Do you believe in hanging? I hope you don't.
We do.
You do? Well,
Yes,
I think you should
we
read
do.
that and see what it says.
What
Okay?
about the person that they've just done in?
That, of course, is the majority view, and it's the one which the Police Federation, as the organisation leading the campaign for restoration, is trying to harness. They're advised at Westminster by the Tory MP for Bury St Edmunds, Eldon Griffiths.
Gentlemen, as you know, the House will be taking a decision on Wednesday.
He'll be moving the amendment to bring back the death penalty for murdering policemen, and he sees it as his job to inform other MPs of the Federation's arguments.
I don't believe in heavy lobbying of members. Members are perfectly capable of making up their own mind. But I do think every member needs to take very carefully into account the views of his constituents.
Organisations opposing restoration, like the Howard League, which has been campaigning against hanging for over 100 years, fear that some Tories may be swayed by the argument about listening to their constituents' views. But they insist that on an issue like this, the public doesn't always know best.
The question of public opinion is always a very difficult one when it comes to any question of criminal justice. I think we have to say this. Crime is a social phenomenon. It's a phenomenon which always gives an enormous amount of problem to our society. And the task and the responsibility we give to our legislature is that they make proper provision for the proper treatment of crime.
The Howard League has carried out a survey of all MPs, but since almost all Labour members will vote against, it's the new Tories who will decide the day. The League reckon the abolitionists should win by about 15 votes, but they've written to all MPs to be sure. The post is the easiest way of getting at MPs. Jeremy Hanley, one of the new Tories, is getting about 10 letters a day on hanging. The Police Federation, the Prison Officers Association, the National Council of Civil Liberties, Amnesty and the Methodists have all written, along with many private individuals.
Well, this one is a letter from a lady who listened in church to a Methodist church, and they were encouraging her to vote, to write to the MP to vote against, but she says no, she believes in the death penalty and wants me to support it.
Others queue to see their MPs, but for many members, the pressure came during the election itself. Peter Thurnham is the new member for Bolton North East.
Yes, on the doorstep I got a lot of people who said they would like to vote for me if I was in favour of capital punishment.
The London suburb of Lewisham East is a respectable but tough area.
Good morning. Sorry to trouble you. I'm Colin Moynihan, you're a Conservative Member of Parliament, and I'm doing a ballot.
Colin Moynihan won the seat from Labour with the promise of a constituency referendum on hanging, even though he personally doubts the effectiveness of capital punishment as a deterrent. Now he's fulfilling that pledge and says he'll stand by the result. Not surprisingly, he found a majority in favour of the death penalty, though he did encounter some opposition.
It would, if it was reintroduced, be the ultimate deterrent, obviously.
Never,
the ultimate.
never.
Well, I think it's the judges
I was
in the
alive a
country.
long while before you, and I remember when they were hanging them, and it didn't make a blind bit of difference.
Well,
we had Christies, we had the chappies who done the murders in the bath, we had all them sort of people. It never made a blind bit of difference.
The other way of getting at MPs, of course, is through their local party. Tory activists have long felt passionately about the death penalty.
Real issues conference is that this party and the vast majority of the people of this country want the reintroduction of capital and corporal punishment.
And even though the Tory party doesn't use reselection in the blunt way Labour does, strong views on capital punishment can help an aspiring candidate. David Amess is another new Tory. So how much of a factor was it in his selection?
It was a very great factor. I went to 5 different selection meetings, and at every meeting I was thoroughly quizzed on my views on capital punishment.
Do you think you would have been selected had you not been in support of capital punishment?
I might have, but I somehow doubt it.
Mr Amess is actively working at Westminster for restoration. He was one of 3 new members who was invited by Teddy Taylor, the MP for Southend, to discuss tactics with 3 other MPs who actively campaigned in the last Parliament for hanging.
The argument's always lost in these debates because the other side's not, our side's not organised.
The result of that meeting was an organised flow of statements and carefully drawn up questions. The opponents of hanging are less well coordinated in Parliament than the right, partly because the opposition goes across parties. But this afternoon at Westminster, following a weekend in which the church and religious establishment came out against, along with several ministers, opponents of hanging of all parties came together for a meeting. It was chaired by Roy Jenkins, who argued against capital punishment on pragmatic and moral grounds.
The frailty of human judgment is too great to use a penalty of which the finality is so absolute.
Another former Home Secretary, Merlin Rees, came to show his support, along with Lady Ewart-Briggs, widow of the British ambassador killed by terrorists. But the meeting wasn't well attended. Even so, anti-hangers, like Julian Critchley, believe they will win and are dismissive of those Tories who vote for hanging merely to ingratiate themselves with their parties.
After all, they choose you and they elect you in order to exercise your judgment. And this is not a party political issue, hanging.
Ultimately, of course, it will be a free vote. But it's precisely because MPs aren't being told how to vote by their whips that they've come under such strong pressure from outside organisations. When it comes to it, the great majority will vote according to their consciences. But if estimates like this are right, saying there are still only 6 votes in it, then the effect of all that lobbying could be decisive. But tonight, the word from the Whip's office is that the majority against is nearer 30.
It's unthinkable. So your message to MPs who in particular want the death penalty restored for acts of terrorism is what, in short?
Well, not to allow that justifiable sense of retribution and hatred of terrorism to outweigh that judgment, which is that the restoration, and it is the people who deal with terrorism every day of their lives, know that this would very much increase would very much help the IRA and disadvantage their own efforts. It would be a sort of inspiration rather than a deterrent to the IRA and the INLA.
So your opposition is based more on practical grounds, is it, than moral grounds, or how would you define your position?
No, I'm putting moral grounds to one side. I will always have them. I would not wish to emulate a terrorist by taking his life, but I think the practical grounds are the ones that count and that people should think of very, very carefully before the debate on Wednesday.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Mr. Blom-Cooper, with such a tide of opposition running at the moment against the reintroduction of the death penalty, do you think it's possible that it could happen?
I don't think it's very likely. I think the odds are against, firstly, an adverse vote in the House of Commons on Wednesday, but I think more particularly, even if the vote were to go in favour of the restoration of the death penalty, I think the hurdles, legislative hurdles, are so great that I think one can virtually say the death penalty will not come back to this country.
What would be the consequences of a vote in favour then?
If hanging were to come back, and that's a fairly big if, I think we would see some substantial opposition in terms of some judges perhaps resigning from the bench, I think, and that would also, I think, be very destructive of good administration of criminal justice. And I think, of course, the prison service itself would be in turmoil.
Well, after this vote, will that be the end of it, do you think?
We said that in 65, we said it in 69, we said it in 79, we said it in 82. I really do think this is probably the death knell of capital punishment.
Then how do you satisfy what many people would see as the reasonable demand for punishment, for retribution, rather than rehabilitation, re-education?
I think myself that the last few weeks have taught us, who have been in the vanguard of the abolition movement, a real lesson. And I think the lesson is this, that it's all very well to advocate change and what we regard as sensible, progressive change. I think we've got the job of education now. We've got to go out to the public, not sit back on our laurels and say, well, we now won the battle. I think we've now got to go out and convince the public that in fact what we have proposed and what we have achieved was absolutely right and in their interests.
What about the retention of the death penalty, or the reintroduction of the death penalty, which seems a distinct possibility for acts of terrorism?
In fact, actually, I think that's the least likely. I think that the statement by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland over the weekend is simply a reaffirmation of the point which has been made, that it's probably the one kind of killing for which it would be least sensible to bring back the death penalty. It may be one thing to say that the odd professional killer does his killing in the course of an armed robbery or the like will not arouse any great political opposition or any other kind of opposition. No attempts to free him, no demonstrations, no reprisals. But Northern Ireland presents a situation which all those things are very likely indeed.
Now, if finally the vote goes against hanging, won't that be seen by those who want it returned as another victory for the liberal progressive establishment who are ignoring the real wishes of what they call the moral majority?
Well, I think it will be seen by them as such, but as I say, I think it's our task, those of us who profoundly believe that this is the way forward for a civilized nation, that we've got to convince people that we're right.
Mr. Blom-Cooper, thank you. So there are the views of Louis Blom-Cooper. With me in the studio is a man who's been closely connected with the practicalities of hanging in his former job as an Under Sherrif. He's Mr. Michael Harris, a solicitor. Mr. Harris, just what was your role at the three hangings you witnessed?
Well, the Under Sherrif was the person who was in complete charge of the execution itself over the governor and over everybody else. His job was to execute the order of the court, appoint the hangman, appoint the assistant hangman, test the apparatus the night before, and make sure that everything was properly carried out.
On the morning of the hanging and when it took place, what was the atmosphere like in the prison each time?
The atmosphere was extremely tense. On one occasion, on one execution, as we were walking towards the execution cell, an alarm bell got set off accidentally, and the whole procession of everybody concerned, as it were, stopped dead in their tracks. For a few seconds, then halted and went on. Everybody was extremely tense. The silence was really appalling.
Did it do anything to you in any lasting sense?
Well, for a month before, that is from the time that the sentence was given in the court, one was in a complete state of, well, nerves and just getting on with things and hoping that there'd be a reprieve rather than anything else, and one wouldn't have to carry out one's duty in that respect.
What about the actual ritual of the killing itself?
I wouldn't exactly describe it as ritual. I think it's a very, very, very skilled job. And what perturbs me now is, of course, that there really isn't anybody capable of carrying it out. There aren't people around who have supervised executions. There's Harry Allen, the hangman, who is now 74 years old. And it's a job needing a very fit man, and a man taller than the person he's executing, and
a very technical matter that hasn't been carried out in this country for many years now.
You must have thought about this on each of those 3 occasions and afterwards. What about hanging as a deterrent to capital crime?
I think that when one did it, one didn't think about these things. One just did one's duty, and that was it. So far as thinking about it now, when we are in a position of reintroducing capital punishment, it having been abolished, the boot is really on the other foot, and it's got to be justified. And it seems to me that as far as a deterrent is concerned, it is a very bad deterrent. There's an enormous majority of people who commit murders because there's murders within the family. There's a large number of murders that are carried out by people of diminished responsibility. They're not going to be deterred, and they're probably over 90% of all murders in this country.
Nor, in fact, would they be executed normally.
Well, they would have been under the past law. And the one typical example of somebody who's never going to be deterred by the death penalty, and perhaps is going to be encouraged by the death penalty, are the terrorists. And you're then back to retribution, which in modern society really is no justification for taking a man's life.
Mr. Harris, thank you very much indeed. Brandon Bravo, if we were to reintroduce the death penalty for murder, we should be the only democracy in Europe, in the civilised world, to have that distinction. Is that something you'd like to see in Britain in the 80s?
I don't think the point is relevant. It may well be that all the others are wrong. The thing that strikes me most of all in this matter is that Parliament has totally ignored the will of the British people for, 10 or 15 years. And it is time that Parliament recognised the will of the British people, irrespective of what goes on anywhere else.
But could it not be argued that the clamour amongst the people for the return of hanging is simply symbolic, an urge that people have for tougher penalties, for better detection, perhaps?
It may be, but again, I find far too many members of Parliament pour scorn on public opinion on the basis, well, they don't know what they're talking about. There are times when we have to represent people, and I believe this is one of those cases.
But how do you argue on the basis of the evidence? People are going to argue that hanging is a deterrent, but there is no strong evidence, is there, that it is any such thing?
But it is also a punishment, and we are in danger of getting bogged down with statistics and very subjective arguments as to about whether it would be a deterrent to this person and not a deterrent to another. It is an absolute and terrible punishment, but it is primarily a punishment.
But is it a punishment that a Christian country should be inflicting?
I have had as many Christians saying for as against and arguing from precisely the same moral arguments. That is, I'm afraid, one of the dilemmas.
But one wonders if it is a Christian act in the 1980s for a state to take the life of someone who is in its custody.
Well, if the person is refusing to live by the reasonable moral standards of the rest of society, perhaps at this point in time, where we have to accept we don't have all the answers, then maybe we have got to deliver that person's soul to some higher authority than our own.
In your own mind, what does hanging do? Does it punish or does it deter?
I am seeking the principle first of capital punishment, and I hope Parliament will accept that principle. I would hope and argue for the most thorough investigation into a more humane way of disposing of life. I'm not seeking the most macabre revenge that we can find, and I accept that maybe, if there is no other way, I would have to vote for hanging, but I would seek most earnestly at least to allow society not to have to climb down to the same level of the criminal.
What's it been like in the Commons this last week or so? Have there been pressures? Have you been lobbied a great deal?
Surprisingly, no. I think the lobbying is very much more outside than inside. I think perhaps members are respecting one another's views on this and knowing that there will be pressures. I mean, my mail from my constituency has been fairly heavy, and every pressure group in the country has written in seeking my support for and against.
But you will be voting for?
Yes, I've held this view for a long time myself, with some sadness, I might add, but it is the view of my constituency.
Thank you very much indeed.
The peaceful setting of the University of York was in marked contrast to an intense synod, as the debate on the first day of the annual conference began with a rather rowdy pro-hanging protest. The woman who described herself as a concerned member of the public was led away. There were 2 hours of speeches most fervently condemning capital punishment, but there was a division, albeit a small one.
Given the sinfulness of our increasingly terrorised society, I would wish that it should be available as a punishment, the supreme punishment in certain heinous situations.
But the 560 synod members were more impressed by the arguments against, put most forcibly by the Archdeacon of Nottingham, a native of Northern Ireland.
To reintroduce capital punishment at this stage of that province's turmoil would be to produce a crop of martyrs and build up a store of memories on which violence would feed for many decades to come.
I passionately believe that the grisly process of execution, where even the electric chair is not an infallible method, 3 throws of the switch were needed to produce death in the latest to be executed in April, distracts our attention from the work of improving our prisons and supporting the police in waging their war against crime.
So as members filed through the lobbies, it rapidly became clear that the Archbishop had won the day. But he wasn't completely happy.
I thought myself that in the speeches made, the feelings of the victims and the feelings of those at risk from terrorism were insufficiently expressed, and I would like to have seen a little more of that in the debate and in the final resolution.
There had been hasty discussions to accommodate the vote before the parliamentary debate, and synod members hope that their decision will influence the one to be taken tomorrow. Michael Macmillan, ITN, York. You wouldn't be in favour, for instance, for the reintroduction of hanging for terrorist murders only?
No, I wouldn't. I've pondered that condition very carefully. You see, I believe that at the present time in this issue, there is a matter of theological principle, and I believe that's something that we have to try to say here about the sacredness of life. About only in extreme circumstances, and I don't take the pacifist position, of cases of war and civil insurrection can a Christian be involved in killing. But I have listened to the arguments about deterrence, and it's quite clear that the arguments are not strong that capital punishment would be a deterrent.
Of course, some of your colleagues would argue that there is a biblical backing for capital punishment, for instance, in the Old Testament, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
Yes, certainly they would, but I believe if you look at the whole thing biblically and also apply the Bible to the circumstances of the present day, you will not be convinced by those arguments.
Bishop, could I ask you first what's your case in favour of capital punishment is?
Well, it's a very old, both Old Testament and New Testament one, really, that murder and adultery and stealing are 3 clear-cut laws in the Ten Commandments, and the most heinous of those is the taking of human life. And this is embedded right back in the Bible when, to quote from Genesis, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. And therefore to take human life is the most serious thing that can happen. And that's why the capital punishment issue is a theological matter, really.
Colin Moynihan's ballot got a response from around 6% of his East Lewisham constituents. Over 4/5 were for capital punishment for all the categories he put before them. But the exercise has been condemned by some Conservative colleagues. One suggested it was motivated either by publicity seeking or by cowardice. So is he copping out of making his own judgment?
On the contrary, I'm giving them my judgment. I told them on the doorsteps and over many occasions prior to that my judgment on this one was that the key issue was over the victims, the innocent victims. And if it was going to be a deterrent that was effective by bringing it back, I'd certainly vote hands down in favour. If, however, the martyrdom potential was much, much greater than the deterrent, I'd vote against. But we don't know.
David Crouch, a Tory who used to back hanging, announced today he was now against. Why didn't he hold a referendum in his constituency?
People in all walks in my constituency have been writing to me, and I listened then. But you know, we have a function as members of Parliament to produce legislation and recommend laws for this country, and we've got to think it out amongst ourselves and debate it in public. It's something which we have to do in Parliament. That's our duty. It is not a matter for a referendum. It's a matter for Parliament to digest, knowing how laws should be made, and then hope to make the right law that is just. It's the only way to do it.
Here at Wandsworth Prison in South London, there still exists the hangman's equipment, the only set maintained in Britain. It's not purely a relic of the days before the abolition of capital punishment in 1965. The death penalty remains on the statute book for treason. The last men to hang died on the gallows in August 1964. Peter Anthony Allen was executed at Walton Jail in Liverpool. At the same moment, his partner in murder, John Robson Walby, was hanged at Strangeways Prison in Manchester. The number of offences for which death was the ultimate penalty had gradually been reduced. The Homicide Act of 1957 distinguished between capital and non-capital murders. But this led to certain anomalies. It was a capital offence to commit murder by shooting, but not to poison the victim. It was a capital offence to commit murder in the furtherance of theft, but not in the course of rape. The then Lord Chief Justice, Lord Parker, came out in favour of abolition because of the way the Act had worked. The execution of Ruth Ellis in 1955 had also fuelled the abolitionists' campaign. It roused considerable public disquiet, and crowds gathered outside Holloway Prison on the day of her execution. But the campaign for her reprieve failed, and the death notice was posted for the last woman to hang in Britain. 3 years later, the hanging of Terry Marwood for killing a policeman caused an ugly demonstration by his friends and supporters. One commentator pointed out that the friends and relatives of the murdered constable appeared in comparison to have been forgotten. Those who want Parliament to restore the death penalty say it was a deterrent. There were fewer unlawful killings in those days than there are now. Restoring the death penalty, they say, could save innocent lives. In 1965, the year of abolition, the number of homicides in England and Wales numbered 325. Last year, they'd almost doubled to 618. But that was much in line with the general increase in violent crime. More than 70% of murder victims are personally known to the suspect, with the killing in many cases the result of a domestic quarrel. But the Police Federation, among others, argue that policemen are now in the front line of the fight against crime and more at risk from the increasing use of guns by ordinary criminals. 30 police officers have been killed in the 18 years since abolition. It's much the same rate of police deaths as before abolition. But in the old days, it's argued, criminals like the great train robbers used to frisk each other for weapons beforehand, because capital punishment, they say, was a deterrent. The number of offences involving firearms rose from 1,734 in 1971 to 8,067 10 years later, but the number of those shot dead actually fell from 36 to 32. In Northern Ireland, the death penalty wasn't abolished until 1973, when Mr. Whitelaw, Northern Ireland Secretary, decided it was counterproductive. The scale of terrorism in Ulster has been far greater than the rest of the country. A total of 221 people were convicted of terrorist murders in the province over the last 5 years, to which the death penalty would have previously applied. But in Northern Ireland, there are no jury trials for terrorist offences. And it's argued if men like Bobby Sands were prepared to starve themselves to death, there's no evidence the IRA would be deterred by the death penalty. MPs opposed to capital punishment have had substantial majorities in the past few years. Apart from the moral question, they cite miscarriages of justice where guilty verdicts have subsequently been overturned. A vote tomorrow night in favour of the death penalty still looks unlikely, but if it happens, it would just be the start of a long political battle. Supporters would then have to get a bill through both the Commons and the Lords. Tomorrow night's vote does not specify the method of execution. That's one of the immensely controversial questions that would remain to be settled. Glyn Matthias, News at 10, Westminster.
Ruth Ellis was the last woman to hang in this country. Today, the daughter of Ruth Ellis sat in the garden of her Manchester home, flicking through the new and old newspaper cuttings which tell the tragic tale of the blonde model who shot her lover in a fit of jealousy. Georgina Enston, as she's now known, bears a remarkable resemblance to her mother, whose memory she cherishes, even though she was just a child of 3 when Ruth Ellis died. But for 6 years after the execution, the truth was kept from Georgina. She found out by looking through old photos and newspapers.
Well, I was off school ill at home, and there were just the servants there, and I was in an area of the house where I shouldn't have been, and I was looking in some drawers, and I came across some newspaper cuttings, and I read them, and I didn't understand it at first, but I read them again and again, and finally it sank in what had happened.
What were your feelings at that time?
I was very upset and I was very angry.
Do you ever think about those last days in her life?
Yes, oh yes, of course I do, yes. I often think that, I wonder about the doubts that she must have had, because you see she didn't defend herself, and I wonder if at the last minute she felt that maybe she should have done.
So having said that, how do you feel now about the thought of capital punishment being reintroduced?
I hope very much that this bill doesn't go through. I am totally against capital punishment. I don't think it's right to take life, and if we, as the cool, calm, collected British public, advocate capital punishment as being what we want to do with our criminals, then I think that we are putting ourselves on the same level as the criminal.
But Georgina bears no grudges. She's currently reading the autobiography by Albert Pierpoint, the man who executed her mother. In Georgina's words, he seems like a very nice man. Terry Lloyd, News at 1, Manchester.
Outside the Commons, the great executioner himself, Oliver Cromwell, towered above the early queue of those anxious to hear the debate. A clutch of committed Christian pro-hangers were first in the line just after dawn. By midday, there were 150 trying to get in, the atmosphere itself almost that of awaiting an execution. Of the politicians who arrived here, the man who got rid of hanging in 1965, Roy Jenkins. The man who's leading today's fight to get it restored, Sir Edward Gardner, and the man who would have to put it into effect if it is restored, Home Secretary Leon Brittan. And the people as they waited for the debate.
The thing hanging should come in. They should go to prison for life instead of getting hung.
I don't believe that we should have hanging, because I think that the principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth is not moral.
Two wrongs don't make a right. I'd feel very embarrassed to be in Britain when we'd be the only country in Western Europe to retain hanging as a punishment.
I think it's a pity it's got to be brought back, and I hope it is brought back simply because I think it will stop violent crime.
You wouldn't be prepared to press the button or do whatever?
Exactly. Yeah. I don't think he would either.
But that wouldn't be up to me.
Jon Snow, ITN, Westminster.
The new Home Secretary, just 5 weeks in office, found himself under fierce all-party attack for his recommendation the death penalty should be restored for terrorist murders. Astonishing, extraordinary and disturbing were just some of the epithets used against him. Mr. Brittan came out against capital punishment for most categories of murder, but terrorist violence, he said, posed a different kind of threat. He acknowledged Mr. Pryor's view that the death penalty could lead to worse disorder in Northern Ireland, and that terrorist trials there are conducted in special courts without juries. All this he brushed aside.
Acts of terrorism are crimes against civil society as a whole. While all crimes break and challenge particular laws and may shatter the lives of individual citizens, terrorism deliberately seeks the overthrow of law itself. That is why there will be many people who favour the restoration of capital punishment for terrorist murder on grounds quite unrelated to the deterrent argument.
That when we debate terrorist murders in this House and when they are debated outside, by and large, we're thinking of Northern Ireland and the effects on Northern Ireland. And I therefore ask the Home Secretary, is he really coming to this House to propose and to vote for executing men who have not been convicted by the jury system? Is that what he proposes should happen in Northern Ireland?
The former Prime Minister, Mr. Heath, also attacked Mr. Brittan's proposal as astonishing and impractical. Under attack from Mr. Roy Jenkins as well, Mr. Brittan intervened to suggest that murder trials in Ulster could be conducted by a judge with assessors or a panel of judges. Mr. Jenkins, a former Home Secretary, said this still meant that for the first time for centuries, people in the United Kingdom would be hanged without trial by jury. The problem for the supporters of capital punishment is they disagree about which categories of murder most deserve the death penalty, and this has weakened their chances. Sir Edward Gardner, who moved the main motion, said the death penalty would provide a unique protection for society, but he says the argument about terrorists is the weakest. A new MP, Mrs. Edwina Curry, stressed instead the public concern about rising crime.
Something is wrong.
We seem to have become a lawless and a dangerous society in which brutality no longer shocks but becomes commonplace, and which the carrying of weapons of all kinds in the furtherance of crime has become an everyday matter. And for many, many people in this country, there is the cry that something must be done.
But Mr. Heath said that those who demanded the death penalty hadn't proved their case. The onus of proof must, he said, rest with those who wanted to change the status quo. He, like others, cited the many wrongful convictions.
One of my honourable friends I heard saying on radio today that if nobody else was prepared to hang people, he is quite prepared to do the job himself. Well, the question I would put to him, is a rather different one. Because of his views, is he prepared to be hung by mistake?
There was a general feeling Mr. Brittan's performance had lacked conviction and consistency, that the Home Secretary hadn't helped the pro-hangers case. Opponents were looking increasingly confident that they would defeat the restoration of the death penalty by a comfortable margin. Glyn Matthias, News at 10, Westminster.
Michael McNair Wilson, why can't the hanging lobby take its defeat gracefully?
Well, may I remind you, I'm not part of the hanging lobby, I'm an abolitionist. But I want to see Parliament and people as one on this subject, because I want this subject to go into the history books and no longer be a contemporary matter on the floor of the House of Commons.
But as an abolitionist, you would respect the view of the people on this higher than the view of your colleagues in the House of Commons.
I don't think I've said that, but I do believe a referendum would give Parliament that vital piece of information which it does not currently possess, namely what the British people think about this subject. And I can only tell you from my post bag within the last fortnight that letters against the restoration of capital punishment have been running at about 4 to 5 to 1. Now that's the first time that's happened, and that gratifies me personally because it makes me feel that what I have been voting in the House of Commons is broadly in line with what my constituents want.
So you're saying that the commonly held view that the country is overwhelmingly in favour of capital punishment is wrong?
I do say that, absolutely.
The opinion polls are wrong?
Well, the opinion polls haven't really played any part in this particular debate over the last fortnight for some strange reason, but there was the radio phone-in which showed a very slight majority in favour of the return of capital punishment, and the BBC admitted that they weren't able to take all the calls they got because they hadn't got the time. We had the Church of England vote absolutely categorically against the return of capital punishment. And I have little doubt in my own mind that there is now a majority in this country that does not want capital punishment. But if there isn't, if it is the other way around, as the vociferous groups tell us, then Parliament ought to be aware of that. Because if Parliament gets too far ahead of the people in making its judgments and coming to its conclusions, Parliament ceases to command the respect of the British people, and in those terms fails to end this debate, 7 of which we've had since I first became an MP.
But can we be clear, if a referendum said that there was a majority in the country among the people in favour of the restoration of capital punishment, you would want Parliament to think about overturning the decision it took last night?
Well, one has to qualify that by saying how many people voted, because clearly if only 20% of the electorate voted, that really wouldn't mean anything. So it would have to be a clear-cut majority of a sizable turnout. If that happened, and I think the people could only vote on the principle, then I think Parliament must pay some attention to the fact that it has failed to persuade the nation that people are as safe without capital punishment as they would be with it. And in those terms, that information would undoubtedly feature in the way we reached our next decision if we ever have another debate on this subject.
But of course there's no provision in our constitution obliging members of Parliament to take any notice of what the people actually think.
Well, that's absolutely true, and no referendum can be binding. But if I can just draw one single example, the nation voted to stay in the common market, and that political party at the last general election that told the nation it was going to take the country out of the common market did extraordinarily badly. The nation is today better educated and better informed than ever before, and is quite capable of reaching an extremely sophisticated judgment on these complex issues. And I do not believe Parliament can go on in an 18th century way, laying down the law, without in any way seeking to consult those very same people who have returned each one of us to be in the House of Commons.
But that 18th century way is the constitutional way. Under our system, as I'm teaching my grandmother to suck eggs, I know, but you, the MPs, are sovereign. The people have their say when they pop their papers into the ballot box.
But the day we had the referendum on the common market, the day there was the referendum on Scottish devolution, on the border poll in Northern Ireland, on the future of Gibraltar, was the day that 18th century concept was beginning to die on its feet. And in fact, I believe that we are going to see referenda as part of a modern democracy, and it's clear from what I've said that I, for one, am an advocate of just that.
Thank you very much.